I think you spent a lot of your career, in the first part of your career anyway, in radio. And I think your interest in radio goes way back to when you were a child.
Yes.
Can you tell me a bit about its influence on you?
Well, I certainly remember listening to a lot. I mean, I sort of grew up in the 50s, having been born in 1951. So in those days, it was all the usual stuff like Sunday afternoon with Billy Cotton and the Navy Lark and stuff like that. So I certainly remember listening to radio quite a lot. But it was really when music radio started to appear, the Pirates particularly, that I found myself listening more and more, even to some extent late at night on Fridays, through the static, listening to a fascinating programme on AFN from Munich, I think, called Underground, which for half an hour would play West Coast, what we used to call psychedelic rock stuff. Very strange for the American Army, but there it was. So you could hear these things that you never heard anywhere else.
Subversive music, yeah.
Yes, together with cod adverts, like the only one that sticks in my mind is "There's a time for love, there's a time for hate, and there's a time for cleaning your rifle." I suppose that's Forces Radio for you. But I certainly had influences in terms of wanting to be a DJ, going back as far as Jack Jackson. I don't know whether anybody remembers him. He used to do curious programs where he'd cut together bits of extracts from the Goons and Hancock with the music, which apparently he put all this together in his studio out in the Canary Islands or somewhere. And I tried to emulate that with a stop-start on a tape recorder and things, not particularly well. But there was him, Brian Matthew, who's a ubiquitous part of BBC Radio for popular music at the time, then Kenny Everett, and of course John Peel coming in at the end. And then there were the Pirates. Used to listen to the Pirates a lot. We were on holiday when they all closed down. We were actually in Scotland, in a part of the world where you really only got any AM radio when the sun went down. So after dinner, I went out into the car and listened to various pirate radio stations closing down. I remember Radio Scotland playing lots of bagpipe music.
There's a sort of wake as they closed.
Yes, awake while you're still alive, but just.
But I mean, that led to Radio 1 opening up, I suppose.
Yes, it was great from my point of view. I mean, it was kind of a bit immune to all the session music that was there because we were used to that with the BBC. And I've been listening to the NDO from Manchester for years, playing pop music. So it didn't seem quite so strange that there were always loads of sessions or peculiar people you'd never heard of doing their versions of the hits. Of course, I much later on discovered the joys of needle time and how to use it and how to get round it and all these various other things.
But of course, John Peel was always looking for new sounds, wasn't he?
Yes, I'd never listened to him when he was a pirate, as he was on Radio London and quite late at night. And where I was living near Stoke, the pirate we got best was Radio Caroline North. So no John Peel on that. I suppose the other radio thing that I noted as I was going through thinking, what do I remember, were the rather bizarre stereophony transmissions the BBC used to do on a Saturday morning from sort of late 1959 and through until a couple of years into the 60s. So you'd put the third programme on the left and BBC television on the right, and to hang with any phase errors.
That's right,
and get these stereo programmes. And sometimes they'd play... Yeah, they play pop music sometimes, and they do dramas. I remember listening to, what's the shortest Gilbert and Sullivan opera, Trial by Jury?
Trial by Jury, yes.
Yeah, it's half an hour, so you can get it in a short programme.
Okay, so you left school with an interest in radio, and then you started looking around. Were you were something to do with Radio Stoke, weren't you?
Yes, actually, that started before I left school. If we wind back slightly. My interest in pop music and in folk music was developing. In fact, I would occasionally play Bob Dylan songs in my local folk club. But myself and a school friend decided we'd record an LP of some of the acts who appeared in the local folk club. So this LP was being planned in 1968, called Stoke Folk was the name of the LP. You can find it listed on Discogs if you dig into it. Although we didn't bring it out until sort of September, October of that year. Earlier, it must have been February or so, Don Clayton, my friend who was putting this together with me, we were wandering through Hanley and saw a sign on a building in one of the side streets that said BBC Radio Stoke-on-Trent. So we just went in, walked upstairs till we found somebody and said, we're planning to release an LP later in the year, and hopefully we can promote it on your station. Actually, they were very friendly.
Yeah.
We both sat in as they did rehearsals of evening news and a request programme. And I didn't think much more of that. We carried on. We did put the record together eventually. We released it, whatever that term means, on the same day that the Warsaw Pact countries invaded Czechoslovakia. So we kind of got pushed down the news agenda more than somewhat. But at least I can remember the date. By that time, I'd actually taken to phoning up and annoying the engineer-in-chief and saying, I want to do things, I'm interested in this, can I help? And he eventually relented. And so I started off going in at weekends. I'd go in on a Sunday because they hadn't got very many staff, and there was always a church service on Sunday morning. And I'd help with ringing the microphones, and I'd sit in the radio car, keeping an eye on the dials on the link transmitter while the service was going out. So that was about my first bit of radio work. And other things over the weekend, helping a bit with the sports programme on the Saturday afternoon. And it eventually got to the stage where I was at school quite a long way from where I lived. So what would happen was I'd get the bus from school into Hanley in the centre of Stoke. And from there, I'd then walk to the edge of town to where my father had his business, and he'd take me home when he went home. And there was always a bit of time. So eventually I ended up going into Radio Stoke on my way back and doing a What's On programme. And sort of, I have a memory of sitting there doing bits of homework on the desk in studio whilst reading lists of events that were going on in the local area. So I was very young, I wasn't getting paid. There were a couple of us, we were known as hangers-on. And I think it was a feature of early local radio because a bit of autonomy and people down in London not completely knowing what was going on. So, got away with it.
Good example of pushing your way in. You got in. That was great.
Yes, not, didn't have any relatives involved at all, just basically kept banging on the door. Yes. And there were very interesting odds and ends in those early days. I sort of made a few programmes, but one thing that I remember that has been forgotten a bit was that Radio Stoke did a test transmission in stereo. And this was before Radio 2 had gone stereo on the network. Mm-hmm. So when London found out, they were not happy and various people got their knuckles rapped. Oh. But I remember we spent, I think it was 2 hours on a Saturday afternoon. One of the engineers converted the transmitter to work in stereo. He did this himself. He used a leak trough line receiver to keep it on frequency so it didn't drift. And we basically just played some records. And I remember sneaking in a track from the Beatles' White album in the middle of this because I'd just bought it. That dates it. And the programme organiser came rushing down because he wanted lots of classical music. And there was this Beatles going out. There we are, the Stoke stereo experiment.
Now, that's interesting. Tell me technically how that worked, because presumably other stations were not going stereo at that time because they presumably couldn't handle it.
Well, apart from having to convert the transmitter, you needed two circuits between the studio and the transmitter. But the station, presumably they all did, had a pair of lines. It had a main and a backup. And they went by different routes. So there needed to be some shenanigans electronically to get them back into phase. But Simon Penfold, the engineer, was brilliant at this sort of thing, and he fixed that. So it was quite simple because it was purely a studio, a pair of lines and a transmitter. There was no network to get it through, so it was it was quite simple from that point of view.
Did you promote it? Were people listening in stereo?
Yes, we got quite a few people listening.
Yeah.
I did attempt to get John Peel to present that program a bit out of order really, and of course he didn't. But I was sort of in contact with him in a superficial way in those days.
Had the fact that you'd done this recording and produced this album, did that help you in any way, or were you had your foot in the door already?
Well, the two kind of happened simultaneously, actually. Most of the foot in the door came after the album came out. There was 99 copies. In those days, if you pressed 99 records, you didn't have to pay purchase tax. So we pressed 99, and they were faulty, so we got a second batch of 99 given to us, but it was all done by Pi and a guy in a studio in London. Oh, right. But no, I was really just building up my experience doing studio operations and occasionally reading the news. They had things called station assistants in those days, who'd be the program operations people while the producers were doing presenting and building the programs together. So, say for the morning program, you'd have the PA, the producer, and the SA, the station assistant, the two of us working through the morning program, getting up at the crack of dawn and putting the whole thing together and putting it out, with the producer doing the presenting, although occasionally the station assistant would read the news. So I started off doing some bits of news reading at the time.
Amazing.
As well.
And this is without having had formal interviews or being checked out by the security services.
No vetting, no nothing. No, it's just
Christmas trees on your personal file. Yeah. Okay.
And it included the first Christmas Day programme, because very few of the staff wanted to work on Christmas Day. Myself and Irvin Brooks, another of the hangers-on, we did the studio operations on Christmas Day morning. Mm-hmm. And I remember this was Christmas 68. It was a white Christmas. And one of the producers on the day, Owen Bentley, who later went on to run big chunks of local radio, he and his wife drove me home through the snow at lunchtime on Christmas Day.
Ah, very memorable, yeah. Probably the last time we had snow.
Pretty well, I think, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so what happened to you after this? You were at Stoke, you were reading the news, which is amazing.
Well, in the middle of all this, I went down to university. I got into Imperial College to read electrical engineering. Mm-hmm. And amongst other things, while I was there, I helped set up the Student Television Society, because at that time there wasn't a radio society, although one came along later. So we had a thing called STOIC, Student Television of Imperial College, and I was the first chairman of that. Yeah. So we do a monthly news programme, which was trundled out on a rather strange old 1-inch VTR. Went into the common room with this VTR and a monitor and played back this programme of latest news. And the first programme, we ended up doing an obituary for a very senior member of staff who'd just died. And the obituary was given by the head of the electrical engineering department, he was Professor John Brown. Turns out he's Gordon Brown's uncle, I discovered many years later. Gordon Brown, the Prime Minister.
Yes, yes.
And during the course of that, I was also getting involved with Radio London, because in my second year at Imperial, the head of local radio, who had been the manager at Radio Stoke, asked me to go and go into the new Radio London setup and help to teach them how to use the equipment. Really? And of course I did, and I got involved in Radio London, and I was involved on and off with Radio London for quite a long time after that.
Did all this affect your study?
Don't mention the war, as they say. Actually, it wasn't Radio London so much. During the course of this, and unfortunately in 2 successive Junes, I got asked to present a few programmes on Radio 1, which was an offer I couldn't really refuse. And the first time round was okay. I did 4 programmes in a slot on Saturday night, which was a special new slot. I think it was called Pop Workshop for new DJs, and I was one of the 4 people who did those. So I did a programme on a Saturday, and that one worked out fine. I sat the exams. I didn't do brilliantly, but I passed. The following year, the timing wasn't quite so good. I was asked to sit in for Bob Harris for 2 weeks, And the first of those programs was the night before an exam for a subject I wasn't that good at. And I failed the exam, and because of the way the system worked at Imperial, because I failed one exam, I failed the whole course.
Oh, golly.
Because now it's all done on coursework and you get up points. But in those days, it was a bit draconian. The only thing I can sort of say in my defence is that during this period, I discovered a serious impediment to me actually getting a job as an engineer, because I'm red-green colourblind. And when I had my interview for the course at Imperial, I specifically said, look, I'm colourblind. Is that likely to be a problem? And they said, no problem. We've got plenty of graduates who've gone on to do jobs, da-da-da-da-da. Unfortunately, during my first or second year at Imperial, all the major employers, and the one I was interested in was the BBC, but the Post Office and various others, they brought in rules that they wouldn't employ anyone who was colourblind as an engineer. So my opportunity for actually doing the job I was training for was whipped away from me without warning.
Is that why they changed the colour of the earth wire on electrical circuits?
It is, yes. And they made the earth two colours, of course, to make it doubly...
Interesting.
Yeah. Unfortunately, brown as the live colour isn't a brilliant one for colourblind people, but usually blue is not too bad. But yeah, that's exactly why. And of course, I was never any good at resistor colour codes. I had to use a meter. But that's fine. You can use a meter for that.
Yeah.
So yes, there we go. I will admit it.
But this is amazing, Andy, that you're appearing on Radio 1. You're doing all sorts of things. You read the news in Radio Stoke. I mean, it's before you even leave university. So presumably you were thinking, I'm definitely going to work for the BBC.
Yes, as did plenty of people at university. There was an article in Felix, the Imperial College student magazine, that bemoaned the fact that hundreds of graduates were trying their best to get an interview with the BBC, and here was this undergrad who's already doing programmes and stuff. And I was doing quite a lot. I took part in a kind of early zoo type programme on Friday nights called The Pictures Are Better, which had lots of guests and people in there. So through that, we had a setup where there was a main presenter, David Carter. There was a guy who did the news, Bob, I can't remember his second name, sorry Bob. And there was the programme manager from the station, John Hunt, and myself, and I sat in a desk in the studio, and we all used to kind of talk. David was almost impossible to interrupt, which, as he always had his back to me, meant there were lots of occasions where I'd start talking and I couldn't get a word in edgeways. It must have sounded really strange. But we had loads of interesting people come in, ranging from Jenny Agutter, Wilfred Bramble, and the one I remember who didn't turn up was Liberace. We'd all hoped that he was going to come into the studio, and I said on air that I'd got the chandelier ready, but he didn't come in. So that one, The Pictures Are Better, went on for ages. That's fondly remembered. David Carter produced an overnight programme, the first time they'd been broadcasting overnight in the UK. And he did a wonderful fiddle in order to get this past the BBC management. He organised to go and interview the Minister of Posts, Chris Chataway. And I manned the ewer for this occasion, so I went in with him, met up with Mr. Chataway and his private secretary, a formidable lady whose name I remember as Miss Goose, who was apparently famous. And David interviewed Chris Chataway about broadcasting and things, and in the course of it said, can I do a programme overnight? And Chris Chataway said, well, there's no reason. There's nothing in law that says you can't broadcast overnight. So, of course, we did the programme overnight, which was quite interesting. I got into a bit of bother with the police, though, because I went out with the radio car and at one point went to Covent Garden Market, which was still in operation at the time, with a reporter, parked the car, shoved the mast up, and was very quickly moved on by the Covent Garden police, who were not having any of it. For a couple of years during vacations, summer vacations, Whereas in the first year I went back to Radio Stoke for a couple of months. The second 2 years, which would have been 71 and 72, I went to Radio Oxford because Owen Bentley, my old colleague from Stoke, had become programme organiser at Oxford, and he asked me to come down and join in there. And that was great fun. That was interesting because Stoke was a Mark I station, one of the original 8. And Oxford and London were both Mark II. So in both cases, the equipment is similar but slightly different. The setup becomes a bit more, dare I say, well, I was going to say professional, but perhaps I mean permanent in a way, because now the BBC is taking it seriously. So you have circuits to connect up to places and a better radio car. I had to take a test to drive a BBC vehicle. You did in those days. And I drove around Crystal Palace Transmitter in an extremely grubby reporter's car with a guy who pronounced me fit to drive BBC vehicles and asked me why I signalled when I turned at roundabouts, which seemed a bit odd. But since there was a story that at least one of the people on their test at Radio Stoke had managed to crash the car but still passed, it kind of made you wonder that actually it was for insurance purposes, of course, rather than anything more.
Okay, Radio Oxford, where was that?
It's not far from where it is now. It's in Summertown, so you're sort of heading out on the Banbury Road. And it used to be above a car showroom that sold Rolls Royces.
Yes.
Very nice studio. I do remember if you were doing the early evening shift, so everyone would go home apart from you, and what you had to do was there was a half-hour tape programme, and then you'd do a final news summary and close down. But because there was nobody else there and you needed to get something to eat, what I used to do anyway was I'd put the tape on, grab a transistor radio, pop over the road to the local cafe, grab a sandwich, and then go back and finish eating it in the studio, always with the radio on just in case something dramatic happened. Yeah. Couple of things worth mentioning with Radio London, I think, because I've mentioned the pictures are better. But one of the first things I did, which has a link to Imperial College, was I did a live interview and demonstration with Robert Moog, the Moog synthesizer man.
Oh, did you? Yes.
He gave a lecture to one of the myriad societies at Imperial College with this machine. And I just went up to him afterwards and said, look, I'm connected to the local radio station and it might be possible to come in and do something live in our hi-fi program. Sounds good. And he said yes. So I phoned them and said, can we do this? It sounds like a great idea. They leapt at it. And so I ended up interviewing Bob Moog, and he demonstrated the synthesizer. We set it up in Studio 2 in Hanover Square, which is where Radio London was in those days. And he was demonstrating various sounds and things. We had to pause halfway through for some football results, I think, and bits of commentary, which amused him. And there was a phone-in of people ringing in and asking him questions. So I have a tape of most of my interview, but I don't have a tape of the phone-in, unfortunately.
Now, this was an analogue synthesizer, if I remember rightly, wasn't it?
Yes, yeah. Then we're notorious for going out of tune, of course. But basically, it was all based on 1-volt amplifiers and things. So you could feed one amplifier or an oscillator into an amplifier, into an envelope generator, all sorts of things.
But you could play more than one note at once, could you?
Not on that one. No, actually, it was a long time before you could play anything, play any chords. Polyphonic synthesizers didn't come in for a long time. I, as a slight aside, I do have limited experience of what was probably the world's most sophisticated analog synthesizer, which was several Moogs linked together with some other electronics. A thing called Tonto. Now, Tonto, the original New Timbral Orchestra, was owned by two American guys, Bob Margouleff and Malcolm Cecil, who lived in Malibu. And I did an interview with them for one of my Radio London programmes, got on quite well, went out to LA in the summer of '65 for a couple of weeks and stayed with them both. And the Tonto machine was set up in Malcolm Cecil's living room, for want of a better expression. So it was big, really. It was I don't know how you could describe it. And the strange thing was I wandered in the middle of the night once, being slightly sleepless, and Tonto was there basically playing tunes to itself with no human intervention. But Bob and Malcolm did a lot of work with Stevie Wonder. All his electronic stuff was with them. They got a Grammy for one of them. Another important thing for me on Radio London was a program called Fresh Garbage. This was a program of new music. I took the title from a track by an American band called Spirit, and of course used it as the theme. And this ran between 1971 and 1973. And I did some of it when I was at tail end of university, did some when I was at Radio Stoke, travelling down on the train every Sunday. And that built up a good reputation. It was taken off air as part of a rationalisation on the station just before the commercial stations opened. The other thing I did regularly was to do tech ops for the Saturday sports programme. And we had reporters phoning in from football grounds to give updates on what was going on. But there was so much noise at the other end. So the way it used to work was that having warned them and set them up, they'd be coming in on telephone units or lines or something. I would basically shout, "Go!" in a very loud voice down the phone before whamming the fader up on them, because they couldn't hear the proper cue. All they could hear was me shouting, "Go." I did meet a man in a pub many years later who said, "You're the man who shouted 'Go' at me on football matches." But the football matches were quite fun in local radio, certainly in the early days, because you'd have stringers phoning in reports from some of the away matches. And occasionally you'd have to ask them to do it again because they'd start saying comma, full stop, semicolon, because they were used to doing newspaper copy. So I think that's probably most of the important stuff on Radio 1 until I came down to London.
So how did you come to move down, and what did you do then?
Well, that was a bit of a plot. I'd been, having left university, I'd been working full-time at Radio Stoke for a few years. And then come about 1975, I was offered a freelance position in a department called Foreign Recordings in Broadcasting House. And I ummed and ahed a bit about that, but I was kind of pushed because the Radio Stoke people said they weren't going to renew my contract. So it kind of encouraged me to move down to BH. I discovered later that was really just to get me to go, and if I'd said I wasn't, they would have kept me on. One thing I should say, actually, is that moving down into Broadcasting House, having been in local radio, was a bit of a shock in some ways. I mean, I'd been doing studio operations, editing, all that kind of things, recording bands and folk groups in the studio and exploring with things like using the gents' toilet as an echo chamber. And I got down to Broadcasting House and I wasn't allowed to do any editing myself. I had to instruct somebody else in how to do it. That took a little getting used to, I have to say. However, I moved down to Foreign Recordings. Now, this is a fascinating department, or was a fascinating department, because basically this is where all the stuff from overseas in radio came into the BBC. So it was a library, but it was for material from overseas radio stations and a few other production sources. This was the normal programming, so lots of music, which is why they wanted me. And the department used to compile LPs, which were sent out to local radio stations to get around the limitations of needle time. So we were taking stuff from film soundtracks, which were non-needle time because of an agreement with the archaically named Kinematograph Renters Association. There was stuff from foreign radio stations, and there were things from production libraries. Some of this production library stuff was amazing. There was one I remember called the Standard Library from the United States, which had big bands and some really good, relatively modern material in there. And the foreign radio station things included Voice of America. So we had recordings of Newport Folk Festival things.
Can I just stop you there? I mean, people hear the term needle time, but I don't quite understand it. And I think I'm in that category.
Okay, well, from what I can remember, the 10-cent tour. Needle time was a restriction placed upon the BBC by the representative body for the record labels, the Phonographic Performance Limited. And this was also under pressure from the Musicians' Union, who of course also still have a bit of a lever over PPL. The logic being that the Musicians' Union wanted to get employment for their members on radio, which is fair enough. The record companies, by the time I was involved in this, they had long ago realised that radio play was good for business. So there was no particular reason for them not to. In fact, one American contact of mine actually looked at me incredulously and said, "You mean the record companies restrict you playing records on air?" As if it was the maddest thing in the world to say. Yes. And so having access to material that was not under the Needle Time label was very useful. Local radio at the time had 1 hour of Needle Time per day aggregated over the week. So you needed other things because, say, the morning strip programs, the evening, we didn't call them drive, but sort of afternoon kind of things. They needed some background music to fill in and just leaven the newsy aspects and so on.
Were you allowed to play the same music more than once within your hours allocation?
I think in theory you could have just continually played one track for an hour. It didn't really matter.
No.
There were supposedly some ways that you could use commercial records that didn't use Needle Time, which did have some restrictions. For example, if you were reviewing a record, you gave the label a number and you said how marvellous or how rubbish it was. Although, to be honest, you wouldn't play it if it was rubbish. Then that didn't count against Needle Time. If you were illustrating something, so you had somebody in and you were playing tracks by theirs as you went through, that wouldn't be Needle Time.
Mm-hmm.
And the theme tunes for your programme were not Needle Time. So those were other ways around it. Supposedly, I did read very recently actually, that you were only supposed, on one station, you were only supposed to review a record once. I'm not convinced that anybody ever obeyed that. Certainly if you were reviewing a record, an LP, you might play one track a couple of weeks, one track 1 week, one track the next, say. You generally wouldn't repeat things. So you just had to be a little bit careful.
This is separate from the Performing Rights Society.
Yes.
You had to tell people what you were playing in order to give them money.
Yes, well, PRS, Performing Rights Society, represented the composers, basically, and lyricists, and the music publishers. So they always got logged and they always got paid, no matter what the source of the material was.
But there was no limit on what you could play, on how much?
Not at all. Not at all.
That's clear.
In fact, I think there was a fixed sum of money, obviously going to be millions of pounds, from which the performing rights were carved up, rather than sort of saying this track is going to cost you £6 to play, for example.
Yes.
What would happen would be that particular track would be 1/10,000,000th of the total amount of money that was paid in the year. But statistically, these numbers were all big enough that you could roughly say how much you would get. It was such that I did work it out once. I hope it's true because I worked it out and I'm supposed to be able to do these things. That if a record company, I use this argument with record companies sometimes, if they gave me a record and I played it on air, the music publisher got more money than they would have got by me buying the record or by the station buying the record. Of course, not all record companies were members of PPL, although we were never officially told this, because the Gramophone Library was in the same department of Broadcasting House as the Foreign Recordings Unit. I got to know a lot more about some of the details, that only PPL members actually counted as Needle Time because it was an agreement with PPL. Right. If they were not PPL members but were members of IFPI, which is the international equivalent, say usually an American company, then to be honest, I'm not quite sure whether they were Needle Time or not. I tended to assume they were. Yeah. But there was a third category which was labelled SFL, Small Foreign Label, which is basically someone that's so small they're not members of anything. And basically you could play them. But in theory they could, if you play a record from an SFL company, they could come and knock on the door of the gramophone librarian and say their record's been played, and he'd check against the logs, and they'd then pay them the money as a completely separate thing. I only know of that happening once, but in theory that you could do that. So, I mean, I know music copyright and using music in broadcasting is an extraordinarily complicated business. So
very difficult, yeah. Okay, right. So you're in this department, but is that also part of the transcription service? We're doing recordings, presumably for sending the other direction.
It's the diametrical opposite of that, because that's where I went next. And I just applied for a job as a pop music producer, and to my joy, I got it. And yes, transcription services took BBC programmes and in some cases made their own programmes, which were for sale to foreign radio stations. So the diametric opposite of the Foreign Recordings Unit. I was producing a weekly programme called Top of the Pops, which had been going long before I took it over. That was presented by Brian Matthew. It had actually been going longer than the television version, so it had the name first.
Oh, really?
And that was a mixture, 50-50, of gramophone records and sessions, because there was also a limitation. We couldn't put together a programme that was 100% commercial gramophone records. And that was Brian Matthew, one of my early heroes. I got to work with him for years. Lovely chap.
Did you have your own studios there, or were you using normal radio studios?
Oh, well, as transcription service, it had an amazing engineering department. It had a load of channels, which are rooms in which you process recordings, if you like. They're studios without the studio bit, control rooms, including 2 disc cutting channels. And it had 2 studios. It had a really big studio that you could get a small orchestra in, and certainly do a rock band. And a smaller studio for doing interviews and presentations. Right. And this was in Shepherd's Bush in a building called Kensington House, which I think has now been turned into a hotel.
It was built along the railway line.
That's it. That's why it's a funny shape. It's strange, actually. Every single BBC office I've been in has either been, well, certainly vacated, but in most cases knocked down since I left. So there you go. That's what comes of being away. It wasn't just Top of the Pops, though. I was also doing a weekly interview programme, mostly taking stuff from Newsbeat on Radio 1, and involving the excellent Richard Skinner, who's one of the best interviewers I ever worked with. We did that for a while. That was called Rockline. And I pulled along doing that, working with the engineers. I missed out on most of the quadraphonic stuff that transcriptions had done. Just before I got there, they'd done things like recording a performance of The Tempest in quad.
Oh, really?
A lot of these recordings still exist, of course. Though oddly enough, my first professional contact with transcription services was quadraphonic, in that while I was in the Foreign Recordings Unit, I'd started getting involved with Radio London again because the regular presenter of a programme called Breakthrough had got himself an attachment to Arena in television. And so he asked me to take over the programme, and I did this for about 18 months. And as one of the things that I did was I'd occasionally organise concert recordings and broadcasts. And sometimes, because transcription services recorded some concerts of their own that didn't go out on Radio 1, I'd sometimes put them out on Radio London. But the first thing that brought me together with them was that I'm very fond of synthesizers, you might have gathered, and I heard that Isao Tomita, the Snowflakes, a dancing Japanese chap, was going to be doing a concert at Hammersmith Odeon, as it was then, not where the current Odeon is. And so I arranged to record it for a broadcast on Radio London. And because Tomita's sound system in the theatre was being set up for surround sound, for quad, transcription services, who I got pointed to and said, oh, they can do this for you. Great. They love to do this. They'll love to do this. Won't charge you. They were going to do it in quad as well. So we turned up all this wonderful equipment and just discovered that basically, with the exception of one poor chap who was playing piano live in one piece, everything of Tomita's was being played back off tape. He was just sitting on stage. I'm told he wore a samurai outfit, but I never actually saw him on stage. So yeah, we recorded the concert. So, that's fine. I got on with him quite well. He took me out to lunch afterwards, asked me that wonderful question, what piece do you think I should do next? To which I said, well, you should do The Rite of Spring. And he said, oh, no, it's far too difficult. I'm going to do The Planets. So I looked at him and said, okay, but watch out for Imogen Holst, because I knew that Imogen was very, very fierce in protecting her father's legacy.
Yes,
and at the
yes.
time, Planets were still in copyright. And of course, she slapped an injunction on him as soon as the record came out.
Oh, really? Interesting.
Yeah, though in the end, I think it was only applied in the United States. But yeah, she wasn't particularly happy. Towards the end, when I was in transcription services, I did a couple of more programmes for Radio 1. There had been a suggestion, Johnny Beerling very kindly thought that because I'd been quite good with my Top of the Pops programme at predicting what was happening with the charts. If you think about it, the programme was cut on disc and sent out to be played by the stations. I was always producing this programme a week ahead of when it went out. And so I got quite good at working out what was going up, what was not, what was likely to be interesting. And Johnny started to think, well, maybe I could get you into Radio 1 to help with the playlist and maybe do some programmes. So he got me a couple of bank holiday programmes, which we also made as kind of stereo showcases, because Radio 1 was only just then starting to split away from Radio 2 in its use of the VHF stereo transmitters. Normally they shared them quite a lot of the time. And the first one of these programmes was great. I had a good time. The second time, for reasons that I still don't totally understand, it all went a bit toes up. I think the programme, as far as the listeners were concerned, was okay, but I was feeling uncomfortable, and I got a bit upset with myself and the producer, and I just decided Radio 1, I haven't got the temperament for this, something like that. And so I never got involved with them again. The amusing part of this was that one of the things that had annoyed me was that I'd accidentally played a single by The Who called Who Are You, which in the fade-out chorus has Roger Daltrey singing Who the Fuck Are You a few times. And I'd played this on Radio 1 at 3 o'clock on a bank holiday afternoon. So I thought, they wouldn't want me back anyway. The programme was up for programme review, which is where senior management listen to various programmes and discuss them and comment on them. And my then boss showed me the minutes, and they commented on me and said a few things about the programme. But maybe it was the Emperor's New Clothes, but nobody mentioned The Who. So there you go. I got away with that. And I did a few little forays into science fiction. One of which was having a lovely meeting with Douglas Adams just after Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy did its first series. He came in because we were going to distribute Hitchhiker to overseas stations. And I was asked to just have a chat with him, take him down to the bar for a drink. So, yeah, we got on very well. And in one of the list of things I wish I'd followed up on, he said if I ever thought of some good plots for Doctor Who, I should get in touch, because he was going to be the script editor for Doctor Who. But things happened and I never did. He comes into the Domesday story very briefly because he did a little bit of work on that for us later. But I won't keep you from Domesday for very long. I just say that I did a pilot for English by Radio on using science fiction as a means of talking about English for processes and communication and things. And even had a chat with an author named Christopher Priest, who's quite a famous author, about working on something like this with him. But he put me in my place nicely by saying, look, I'm terribly sorry, but BBC fees just can't cover what I get. If I write a story for Omni, I get £3,000. There's no way BBC fees are going to get anywhere near that. So I won't have the time to help you with this. So we tried. We tried anyway. There's a couple more interesting things from Radio London, because I'd get asked to do a few other things besides music programmes. I did the occasional phone-in, and the one I remember most was when Robin Day and Milton Schulman came in. And Robin had just produced his book called Day by Day, and I think I said to him at the beginning that being asked to interview him was a bit like being asked to paint a portrait of Leonardo da Vinci. And he gave me the strangest look. He wasn't an easy interviewer. I was far too unprepared in many ways. So when he and Milton Schulman started talking about potential developments in TV, I basically just sort of sat back and left them to it. And somebody phoned in who I think, having listened back to the tape, I think he was actually a journalist specialising in media. And he was asking the questions I should have asked, which was fine by me. And he got them talking about the fourth television channel, because at this point, the government was just starting to work out what to do about that fourth button on everybody's TV sets. And that was quite memorable. I did a few more of those hi-fi programmes, Sounds Good.
What was your impression of Robin Day then? Was he slightly fierce?
He was willing to chat. I don't think he thought too much of me, which kind of meant he held back a bit. He was physically imposing. I think someone once said of Raymond Burr that he was an actor who was so physically large that he looked as if he'd sat down in a wing chair, put his overcoat on over the chair, and then stood up again. And I felt that about Robin Day in many ways.
And the fierce glasses, yes, quite.
Yes, and the sort of looking down ever so slightly on you. He wasn't unpleasant, and he was very cooperative. I did at one point politely ask him just to pause so that Milton Schulman could get a word in edgeways or something. And then a few moments later, when he was going to say something, Robin Day turned to me and said, "And now if I may, Mr. Chairman," and which I felt was hilarious. So,
yes.
I have a recording of that programme, and it's I'm putting some tapes into the National Sound Archive at the British Library, and that's one of them.
Good.
So scholars will be able to listen to my embarrassment for years to come once the tapes become available. Now, the Foreign Recordings Unit was led by a guy named John Ross Barnard. He comes into our story again in a short while. But he was very keen on finding ways of getting this non-needle time music out there. So he concocted a half-hour programme of music, of non-needle time music, mostly big band stuff, called She'll Be Coming Round the Mountain. And we used to send that out to BBC local stations. And the deal was that if they paid me a small fee for presenting it, they could have the programme. So that went out on half a dozen or so stations. A lot of the music coming from an orchestra that apparently was kept at NORAD in, is it Cheyenne Mountain? Anyway, whatever that huge mountain is where the thing is. They had a big band in there. And the most amazing trombone player, whose name I think I remember as Dave Nordland. And this stuff coming out of the American military, basically records to promote the army on radio stations, especially American radio stations, but the BBC will do. You're non-commercial, you can play this. It was brilliant. Most amazing performances, most amazing recordings. And one more memorable Sounds Good, the hi-fi programme, was I decided to do one on quad. And I'd been trying to find someone I could talk to at a slightly academic but accessible level with about this. And I was introduced to a guy named Michael Gerson. And anyone who's anyone in the audio business at that level will now remember Michael Gerson. He's dead now, sadly. But he was one of the people who worked out how things like ambisonics work. So he was obviously the right man. And I asked him, well, we're doing all this for 4 speakers, for quadrophony, but in your opinion, how many speakers should you have to get a proper reproduction of a sound field? And he paused and said, probably about 10,000.
Ambisonics, that was something that BBC R&D developed, and they had an ambisonic rig, didn't they, in the proms for experimental transmissions, and they made a big thing of it a couple of years ago, but it's gone quiet now.
Well, all that stuff is still around. A lot of it came out of the work, I believe, for a mono and stereo compatible matrix system for quadrophony. In other words, one that you could transmit down a stereo channel and then decode 4 channels out of later. Yeah. The record companies had 3 versions, or 3 main ones. There was SQ, which was from CBS in the United States, and transcription services issued a lot of recordings in SQ, including my Tomita concert. There was QS, which was a bit like SQ but rotated through 90 degrees apparently, and there was one called CD4, and CD4 actually had subcarriers, so it was like putting FM radio onto a gramophone record. And they died out in the late 70s, I think partly because it was proving difficult for people to work out how you can do a setup at home that doesn't sort of position you in a chair,
Yeah, the ambisonics that the BBC did recently, you had to listen to them on headphones. that they only worked on headphones.
That's a neat way around the whole problem. Of course, that's binaural, and it's relatively easy to make adequate binaural recordings. You just need a spaced pair of microphones, and when it's working well, it's quite extraordinary. I did some work testing Matrix H, which was the BBC's Matrix. I got loaned a decoder amplifier, so we could listen to things at home and listen to discs and so on. Unfortunately, it got stolen. I was off in Canada on a duty trip, and one of my flatmates left a window open, and my hi-fi got nicked, including this unique BBC amplifier. And I have to say, the BBC were very good. They didn't make me pay for it. But Quad didn't take off in the end. My personal feeling was because the FCC, the regulatory body in the United States, wouldn't agree on which coding method stereo radio stations should use. So in the end, interest just died away. Surround sound is very popular still for people with home cinema, but then you're sitting in a specific place in order to watch the screen. Yeah. So it takes away one of the big problems.
Now, we're presumably going to move on to some extent to your work with teletext and television, or at least with interactive
that goes
television
via BBC Video. This is where John Ross Barnard rears his head again. That I was the producer in transcription services, and he phoned up and said, "I'm starting BBC Video. I'd like you to come and work for me, because I know you're good at starting things up and you're quite technically savvy." And so I decided to go on attachment to that. So at that time, BBC Video was just half a dozen people in a building in Ealing, and we were looking into the possibility of releasing programmes on VHS and Betamax. It was a curious time, because people now, I think, don't quite realise how, well, in a way, how bad the starting moves were with home video. We had no idea how it might reach the market. The main thought was that you'd sell it through a store that dealt with the subject. So a music store would sell music videos. So far, so good. That does work. But you'd sell gardening ones through a garden centre, and, I don't know, brass bands through a brass band store, or things like that. The idea of there being stores that just sold videos seemed alien. Also, rental was the big thing. Consequently, if you wanted to buy one of the tapes from the early days of video, and we're talking 1980 here, the cost would have been about £80. They were ridiculously expensive. The idea being that the shop would buy them and then rent them out. But they were trying to organise themselves. I went to a meeting in a West End cinema to set up a trade body for what were then called videogram producers. This was organised by various record labels. And I remember someone standing up with something that stuck in my mind and is still true. He said, "The great enemy of the video revolution is sleep." And there was a bit of toing and froing at this meeting. The non-record company people threw out the idea of the record companies having half the seats on the board. But after that, it got set up, and I think it's still going, that particular body. And I sort of put together a few bits of videotape things. I sort of learned how to compile and produce things for videos using those old 2-inch machines. 1-inch ones were coming out at the time. But it was really a very, very almost industrial process with lots of vacuum pumps and whirring motors and things.
What were the 2-inch videotape machines?
Quadruplex 2-inch ones. I started off in what was called Bilton House, which is just on the edge of West Ealing, and then moved to Woodlands when Enterprises got their own building just north of the flyover. That again is now demolished. I blame myself for all these demolitions, of course. But along the way, I was introduced to video discs.
Now, people will probably have forgotten or not even have a clue what these things are.
Well, it's like an LP, but it plays pictures into your television. That's essentially what it is.
Same size as an LP, but a similar technology to the CD.
There were 3 or 4 competing systems. Technically, the best one was called Laserdisc, which was backed by Philips and Sony. And then there were a couple of others. There was one called VHD. To be honest, I forget, but I'm sure you can Google it and find all these things. And they did coexist for a while. Laservision in the end was the most successful. There was one RCA back system that ended up also almost being given away. Some of them, most of them actually, had discs that were in caddies. So you had something that was just a bit bigger than an LP sleeve, and you had to slot it into the machine and pull the sleeve out because you couldn't touch the surface of the disc. The laser discs were a bit more rugged, like a CD, and they were the direct ancestor of CDs.
So you had VHS tapes being sold commercially in the high street. What's the idea with the video disc that this would be a new form of domestic?
Yeah, in exactly the same
system.
Retail channel as VHS, because by this time Betamax had gone, really. Although Philips tried one, there was a rather late entrant called Video 2000 that came out for a very short while. Just when you think, oh, it's a bit late, why are you doing this now? It was very sophisticated, and you could actually turn the cassette over to get a second side of coverage. But I think that was just too late on the market, really. VHS had cornered the whole thing and survives still.
But the selling point for the much lamented video disc was presumably quality, was it?
Yes, they could be difficult to make run at good quality, and we didn't completely manage to get absolutely the best out of them in those early days. But they were certainly much better quality and much better colour, particularly, than VHS. As a senior engineer at the BBC once said to me, Laservision discs are good enough for news, which I suspect means they're a sort of like Umatics or something. They could be pretty good. I was rather intrigued by them from a technical point of view. So I wondered whether, because they had the same bandwidth as a TV transmission, I wondered whether you could put teletext on one. And the second characteristic was stability. You mustn't have very much wobble in the signal coming off the disc, and the stability figure for Laservision was low enough. And so we thought, we could put a CFAX magazine on a disc. So John Ross Barnard reckoned that one on natural history would be a good bet. They were in the process of organising to do a video disc on British garden birds, narrated by David Attenborough. And so while somebody in Bristol went and made the disc, I worked with CFAX to produce a whole teletext magazine that was going to sit on this video disc in the blanking being the bits of the old analogue television signal that didn't actually contain a picture. It was called blanking because the screen went blank, and it was there because really old sets needed time for the scan to get from the bottom of one picture to the top of the next one.
Yes, if you had your television badly tuned, you could see the CFAX lines at the top.
At the top.
Yes.
And so we got this together. It had to be mastered, and there we ran into a technical problem because you needed a thing called a teletext inserter to insert the teletext lines into the picture. And there were only two of them in the BBC, and they were in the outputs of the two television channels. They just sat permanently in the outputs of BBC One and BBC Two. Now, fortunately, BBC Two tended to go to Test Garden Music over lunch. So I basically took BBC Two off air to steal its teletext inserter, and we made the master tape by feeding the submaster through this inserter onto another tape machine that could record the whole of the signal, including the blanking, ready for the video disc master. And unfortunately, the BBC didn't have one of those machines. And so the tape was played from the West End to Television Centre, put through the inserter, played back to the same facility in the West End, who then recorded it. And the pictures look okay, but if I looked at the incoming and outgoing pictures on an oscilloscope, I could see how much noise was being introduced in this process. But it's a shame. We could have made it a little bit better, but just didn't have the equipment. But as an experiment, it worked perfectly. You plugged your video disc player into any TV set with teletext, got your remote control out, and you could read all the pages and get subtitles as well.
So the idea of this was to provide textual information around the subject matter that the video disc held as program material.
Yeah, we only ever made the one disc because video discs started to go out of fashion not long after that. But that was the basic idea. Of course, broadcast teletext, CFAX and Oracle and all those, they're basically like newspapers in the TV. They weren't specifically oriented towards the programme itself.
There was a time when the BBC started using the teletext lines to sell data to things like bookmakers.
Yes.
Were you anything to do with that?
I almost was. I was actually offered the job as head of that department, but because of the Domesday project, which I was working on, I decided I'd better see out the Domesday project rather than trying to run a department in BBC Enterprises. I can tell you a little bit more about the data thing. There were a couple of important things the BBC used to do. I've been told this is true. I think it makes sense. There used to be a system for transmitting credit card numbers that had been stolen by broadcast data in order that machines could reject them if they ever got presented at the other end. That was one. I think that was done using lines in the television because there were more lines than CFAX in a BBC signal. And the other thing, which I think still happens, is they use the long wave transmitter at Droitwich with a very slow database system in order to switch electricity meters between off-peak and peak. So there's all these little bits that the BBC was doing. Of course, now you've got the internet, it becomes less important. But if you think about it, in those days, a television network was the best way of getting data across to the whole country in one go.
Let's come to Domesday.
Okay, Domesday. Well, I was finishing off at BBC Enterprises. A video was off by itself, and I'd been moved into a sort of general production department within Enterprises and was doing things like replacing music on TV programmes if the music wasn't clearable for foreign sales, and producing a few video cassette things for people like Alexis Corner, Deep Purple, John Martin, Tom Robinson, so on. And we'd obviously got BBC micros floating about. So for reasons I still don't quite remember, except that I've always been fascinated by computers, I tried connecting a BBC micro to a video disc player. Now, there were two types of Laservision video discs, one of which was an hour long and you couldn't really address it frame by frame. But the half-hour long version, you could address individual frames by number. In fact, you could have a disc that just consisted of single frames. And I worked out how to control one of these discs. I borrowed a player from the people at Pioneer and connected it up to a BBC micro. And using the Bird book, I wrote a little demonstration program that would enable you to select a bird from a menu and watch David Attenborough's presentation on it, or because it had two soundtracks, you could do it without David Attenborough and just have the bird noise. And also using a thing called a telesoftware adapter, I could pull the teletext magazine off the disc and display that in the same program on the computer. And I demonstrated this to the BBC Board of Governors in 1984 while trying to demonstrate the BBC micro. So there's me. I've just been asked, taken to the Board of Governors and said, just demonstrate this computer. I mean, how do you demonstrate a computer? I think at first I said this is a bit like telling you what you can do with a pencil, but I'll show you some of the demonstration programs, and that's basically what I did. But the head of BBC Enterprises looked at this interactive thing. We were calling it interactive video by then, and said, "This is really good, Andy, but how do I make money out of it?" Which is the $64,000 question, literally. And then one day in my office, a guy turns up named Peter Armstrong. He's in network features in television. And he's got the idea of doing an interactive documentary. And so I talk him through the parameters and limitations of the video disc, particularly the fact that if you want to use moving sequences, the total that you've got access to is only 36 minutes. And he went away, and my memory, which I've now discovered is a bit condensed, is that he came back very quickly with the idea of doing something using thousands upon thousands of stills and data. And he basically devised the Domesday project. And this was to be part of the BBC's celebrations for the 900th anniversary of the Domesday book. So this was 1984, and the anniversary was going to be in 1986. So we had a couple of years. And so my next thing was to go off and and joined that team. I was originally the technical lead on the project until BBC Engineering discovered I'd failed my degree and persuaded me that it wasn't something I should do. And also I'd kind of realised that I wasn't really a good man manager. And so we got a proper project manager from one of the BBC Special Projects departments in, who was brilliant, Roger Kelly. And I worked on producing various things for the disc, particularly things which we called surrogate walks, but I suppose you'd now call a form of virtual reality.
No, I seem to remember you could do a surrogate walk through a sort of an art gallery, couldn't you?
Yeah, we used a thing called a Bosch FGS 8000, I think, or 4000, which was a visual computer and generated this three-dimensional art gallery that you could walk through. I mean, it's nothing like the smooth VR you see now. You would go in, you could turn 45 degrees and you could go forwards or sideways in steps and so on. But it was very limiting. But it was extraordinary for the time. We finally made it by 1986, and it came out.
Can I just stop you there? Because one of the most impressive things about the Domesday project, and there were lots of impressive things, you could do all sorts of things with the data, you could use it as a research resource, but also you had the involvement of all these schools right across the country who submitted photographs, if I remember rightly, and then you could look at ordnance survey maps and sort of almost do surrogate walks through their areas. Isn't that right?
Almost. I mean, a lot of this is, of course, following in the coattails of your computer literacy project, if I may say so, sparing your blushes, because that's the reason why there were these computers in schools in the first place.
Yes.
So we asked schools to write 20 pages of teletext-sized text, to take 4 photographs of their area, from which we'd choose the best 3. And each school, and a little later on other organisations and even some individuals, were allocated a 4-kilometre by 3-kilometre block of the UK based on the what I still call the 1-inch ordnance survey map, the 1 to 50,000 map. And this was all sent in by snail mail on floppy disks to Bilton House. It was all collated, shoved onto a VAX mini computer and built into the massive, for then, chunk of data that went onto all the sides of the disk. If you wanted to, you could start at the whole of the UK, work your way in. Yes. Which side of the disk depended on whether you were north or south of the of a line somewhere around Newcastle on Tyne. You could zoom in, go through a 40 by 30 block, and then you'd see whether there was anything in the 4 by 3 blocks, and you could then zoom in. There was always a map, but there wasn't always text. Sometimes there was just miles and miles of nothing, really, and nobody to do it. We had some difficulties, particularly in London, because some local authorities, not very many, used Sinclair spectrums. And there was no means for getting data from a Sinclair spectrum back to London, because you couldn't use a floppy with a spectrum. It had a rather strange tape drive of its own, I think, if I remember right. The only other thing I did at the time that was almost at the same time as Domesday, but wasn't related to it. There were 2 things. For a while, I had a music column on CFAX called C-Tracks, reviewing records and stuff. Actually, my whole broadcasting career has actually been dedicated to the obtaining of free LPs. I ended up doing a voiceover for the Natural History Museum because a guy turned up to use the facilities at Enterprises and I was producing, and his voiceover artist didn't turn up. So for years, and they may still be there are films of me in the Natural History Museum narrating a piece about stranded whales and one about manatees, dugongs, including having to impersonate the sound of a dugong munching on seaweed. So that was the other things I was getting up to while doing Domesday. I was also helping to set up the British Interactive Video Association, which brought together a variety of companies who were working on interactive things. The BBC Open University Production Centre were doing a lot of interactive video things. And after Domesday, the team stayed together to produce a few more interactive projects, including a couple of more Laserdiscs. I did one on volcanoes, but that wasn't the only one.
Let's just do a sort of recap at the end. You're working on this interactive material, which was very interesting and innovative. But of course, the plugs got pulled on the equipment because laser vision players, which were quite expensive, stopped being manufactured. And that really was a big problem.
Yes, but I think by that time, the compact disc was becoming more and more prevalent, although initially it was just a medium for audio. I had been told once by someone at Philips that the idea of actually trying to make a commercial product out of CD-ROM was partly fueled by the Bird disc, because they suddenly thought that actually the members of the public and businesses might be interested in this. So the CD-ROM appeared. CD-ROM was too late for us in Domesday, and actually CD-ROM didn't have anything like the capacity that we would have needed to handle the amount of pictures and video.
But then, of course, you've got Blu-ray DVDs.
They would still be a little bit pushed. And, of course, one of the problems with something like Domesday, which has lots of individual single frames, is that you can't use the benefits of compression like MPEG, which is what you use to get moving video onto these discs. You just can't do it because every single frame is what's called an iframe. It has to stand alone, and as soon as you do that, you really start to eat up your data.
Absolutely, yeah. Can I just stop you there, because one of the most impressive things about the Domesday project, and there were lots of impressive things. You could do all sorts of things with the data. You could use it as a research resource, but also you had the involvement of all these schools right across the country who submitted photographs, if I remember rightly, and then you could look at ordnance survey maps and sort of almost do surrogate walks through their areas. Isn't that right?
Almost. I mean, a lot of this is, of course, following in the coattails of your computer literacy project, if I may say so, sparing your blushes, because that's the reason why there were these computers in schools in the first place.
Yes.
So we asked schools to write 20 pages of teletext-sized text, to take 4 photographs of their area, from which we'd choose the best 3. And each school, and a little later on other organisations and even some individuals, were allocated a 4-kilometre by 3-kilometre block of the UK based on the what I still call the 1-inch ordnance survey map, the 1 to 50,000 map. And this was all sent in by snail mail on floppy disks to Bilton House. It was all collated, shoved onto a VAX mini computer and built into the massive, for then, chunk of data that went onto all the sides of the disk. If you wanted to, you could start at the whole of the UK, work your way in. Yes. Which side of the disk depended on whether you were north or south of the of a line somewhere around Newcastle on Tyne. You could zoom in, go through a 40 by 30 block, and then you'd see whether there was anything in the 4 by 3 blocks, and you could then zoom in. There was always a map, but there wasn't always text. Sometimes there was just miles and miles of nothing, really, and nobody to do it. We had some difficulties, particularly in London, because some local authorities, not very many, used Sinclair Spectrums, and there was no means for getting data from a Sinclair Spectrum back to London, because you couldn't use a floppy with a Spectrum. It had a rather strange tape drive of its own, I think, if I remember right.
Now, the interactive department, which was based, I think, at Elstree,
yes,
suffered after a few years of the Laserdisc being used for the Domesday project, because Michael Checkland decided, for some strange reason, that the BBC wasn't interested in interactivity and closed it down. It's an extraordinary decision, really, looking back.
Yes, we were basically sold off as a sort of management buyout and became the Multimedia Corporation. I was rather disappointed by it because certainly, and this has happened all the way through my BBC career, I'd always taken advantage of the camaraderie and general help that you could always get from other people within the BBC, particularly in engineering departments and so on. If you had a problem or even an idea, there was always somebody, whether it was at Chiswick in designs, whether it was Kingswood Warren with research, or or even the people who ran the videotape machines. If you had an interesting idea that that they would latch onto, they'd move heaven and earth to help you, as long as it didn't cost money, of course. But that was brilliant. All that's happened all the way through my career, and a lot of the work I did with early interactivity was helped by that helpful attitude of everybody. And of course, you leave the BBC, and it starts to melt away. I very quickly realised that the BBC is a completely different animal when you look into it from the outside than it is when you look out from the inside.
Yes, it's also different now from what it was. I think it's less possible to find those departments. I mean,
well, they're all into networks and software now, and they're doing great work. But it's nothing like the kind of things they were doing in my day.
Different. Was that it with the interactive material, or did you go on doing
No, I
other
was
things?
Still carrying on within the Multimedia Corporation, doing a few things there, working on CDI, which was probably the most direct successor to Domesday in the CD universe. It wasn't brilliantly successful, but it did directly lead to MPEG, which is the video compression system that is now used for digital television. And they'd also got me into the world of European projects, because MPEG was heavily worked on during European projects. And actually, as was Domesday. Domesday was part funded by the European Commission as one of the very first projects in all their funding initiatives, which are still going and are now called Horizon. And actually, and so far over the years, I don't do it now, but up until a couple of years ago, I was regularly evaluating and reviewing projects in all these things, all these funding initiatives that involved media or interactivity. Lots of trips to Brussels and Luxembourg. And I wrote a book, or co-wrote a book, about managing projects to make interactive media, which was published between 1996 and 2007.
Well, of course, we don't know what's happening with the Horizon project now.
No, that's all up in the air. I asked the question the last time I was in Luxembourg for one of my evaluations, because that was just after Brexit, and I said, what's going to happen? Is there any point in those of us Brits considering continuing with this? And the Commission people said, oh no, it'll all be fine, it'll be sorted out. The UK will continue in this because there are third-party countries, Canada, for example. But yes, things are up in the air, as you say.
Well, let's bring them down to earth and just sort of round this off. What was your last sort of contact with the BBC professionally?
Well, bizarrely, it was all to do with spectrum planning and radio and television transmission. Because for quite a few years, starting with some work for the Digital Television Group, I used to manage from a database point of view the databases that contain the predictions for initially digital television, but then also digital radio, DAB. Mm-hmm. And when I retired and handed it over, it was after the end of switchover. I just handing everything over to an old colleague who could pick up the baton and run with it. But no, I'd get this enormous database for prediction of television reception in every occupied hectare of the United Kingdom, and the Channel Islands, and Northern Ireland and the Isle of Man, and put it into a form that could be interrogated by online systems. So if you ever looked up what your digital TV reception was going to be during switchover, you would have been looking at the database I used to look after. And
that experience, I suppose, came out of Domesday to some extent, didn't it?
It all followed on, yeah, because I started to get interested in data structures during Domesday, and that proved very useful later on. And of course, all my childhood interests in the minutiae of broadcasting helped a great deal in having conversations with the spectrum planners. So I now know far more than I should do, really, about all these things. It is a public fact, but the thing that's always struck me as strange is that the plan for digital TV actually only promises you good reception for 99% of the year, which means you get 3.5 days of not good reception. Fortunately, most of us get better than that. Yeah. My latest little interaction with the BBC was just talking to a couple of people at the Hay Festival, because I sat in the audience for a couple of BBC programmes, and R&D there was a lady from R&D talking to the Click programme about the things that they were doing. There was a kind of 100 years of BBC little celebration first thing in the morning at Hay.
Oh yes, the centenary. Well, hence 100 voices. So thanks very much for contributing to it. Unless there's anything that you're sort of burning to add, we could shoehorn in.
Only just one slightly light-hearted thing in relation to the last days of the interactive television unit. I had a couple of journalists come over from Japan on different occasions, and the second guy who came, this is because our work was interesting enough for the Japanese technical press to write about us. I always just used to take that as a compliment. And while I was showing my disc on volcanoes to the second Japanese guy, who was interested that the word tsunami is known in English, by the way, Marmaduke Hussey turned up on a tour and came to say hello. And I was trying to explain to the Japanese guy, whose English was okay but not brilliant, just how important and senior Marmaduke Hussey was. It was a bit like that scene in Tony Hancock's Missing Page, where he tries to describe the plot of a novel in sign language in a library. I tried calling him Hussey-sama because I thought sama was how you said Lord something, but I don't think he understood that even, and I was kind of saying me, and I pointed at the floor, pointed at Hussey and pointed at the ceiling, and in the end Hussey just sort of turned to me, grinned and said, "Don't worry, I'm sure it's all right." But he was very sweet about it. He seemed okay to me, but that was the point at which we tended to feel, because of Marmaduke Hussey and John Burt, that things were going to change, and of course they did.
Yes, they did. Okay, Andy. Well, thank you very much indeed for doing this.
My pleasure.
We'll let you know, as they say.